Download every episode of this podcast at historyasithappens.com or wherever you get your podcasts. For people who want to think about current events historically. And now, History as It Happens, October 12th, 2021. The Quad.
The relationship between China and the United States is today totally dysfunctional.
We're four major democracies with a long history of cooperation. We know how to get things done, and we are up to the challenge.
So we stand here together in the Indo-Pacific region, a region that we wish to be always free from coercion, where the sovereign rights of all nations are respected, and where disputes are settled peacefully in accordance with international law.
The U.S., Japan, India, and Australia are the Quad. Not an alliance, more like an alignment, formed to deal with China's rising economic power in Asia and the Pacific. The Quad is playing catch-up, and its work is being overshadowed at the moment by the possibility of war, as China reminds the world it will eventually realize the goal of every leader since Mao by absorbing Taiwan and ending an impasse that dates to the early years of the Cold War. That's next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I have taken this action because of my profound conviction that all nations will gain from a reduction of tensions and a better relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China.
Within this context, the people of the United States will maintain cultural, commercial, and other unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan.
Let's begin with the end of China's Civil War.
October 1st, 1949. In Beiping, Mao Zedong inaugurates the so-called Chinese People's Republic. Zhou Enlai, former peace negotiator,
Yes, that was Walter Cronkite narrating an old newsreel. The Chinese communists conquered the mainland, sending the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek retreating across the Taiwan Strait to Taiwan. And from that moment, every Chinese leader and government has vowed that one day Taiwan will be reunified with the mainland. Also from that moment, China has resented every U.S. attempt to stop that from happening.
Since August 1949, the Seventh Fleet has played a major part in preventing the spread of communism in the Far East, with headquarters at Subic Bay in the Philippines.
After the outbreak of the Korean War the following year, Truman sent the Seventh Fleet into the Taiwan Strait, delaying military conflict in the strait until after the war was over. In 1954, the communists bombarded the offshore islands between the mainland and Taiwan. And the next year, Congress passed the Formosa Resolution that gave President Eisenhower full authority to defend the islands. The two sides would negotiate their way out of the trouble. The communists bombarded the offshore islands again in 1958 and again backed down after the U.S. intervened. Major conflict was avoided a second time. We're going over this history because it matters. Take a look at the headlines reporting wave after wave of Chinese warplanes entering Taiwanese airspace, and President Xi Jinping saying in a speech in Beijing's Great Hall of the People that the goal of absorbing Taiwan must be fulfilled.
Well, the Taiwan issue has been the most enduring and contentious in U.S. China relations, and I think it dates back to the end of the hot phase or the mainland portion of the Chinese Civil War in 1949.
Andrew Scobell is a distinguished fellow with the China program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He and his colleague, Daniel Markey, will be here in a moment to discuss why the U.S. cannot escape the past when it comes to Taiwan. It has a lot to do with what's called the One China policy, affirmed when the U.S. formally recognized and established diplomatic ties with the People's Republic of China in 1979, 30 years after its victory in the Civil War. That same year, Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act. The act states the U.S. must help Taiwan defend itself. Here is President Carter explaining U.S. policy. It's worth listening to an extended clip. It runs about 40 seconds.
The United States recognizes the government of the People's Republic of China as a sole legal government of China. Within this context, the people of the United States will maintain cultural, commercial, and other unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan. The United States of America and the People's Republic of China reaffirmed the principles agreed on by the two sides in the Shanghai Communique of 1972 and emphasized once again that both sides wish to reduce the danger of international military conflict. The government of the United States of America acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China.
Going to war over Taiwan's security would seem, well, insane for the United States or China. But we know wars can start by accident. That brings us to the Quad, Japan, India, Australia, and the United States coming together in a soft power arrangement to deal with China's economic might in the Indo-Pacific. After using military power as the primary instrument of foreign policy for decades, the United States is going to try diplomacy. At least that is the stated goal of President Biden.
And as we close this period of relentless war, we're opening a new era of relentless diplomacy, of using the power of our development aid to invest in new ways of lifting people up around the world.
So let's find out more about the Quad by briefly checking in with Washington Times National Security Team Leader Guy Taylor. Hello, Guy.
Thanks, Martin.
So it's been a bit since we've spoken, Guy. A lot has happened in the interim, such as the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, and the Quad held its first in-person meeting of the four leaders. Before we talk about what was on their agenda, when did the idea of the Quad originate, and for what reasons?
It's a great question. The Quad concept goes back to the aftermath of the 2004 earthquake and tsunami that rocked South Asia and Southeast Asia. And in the weeks and months following the tsunami, there was an ad hoc group with the U.S. trying to coordinate aid to areas slammed by the tsunami that year. And this was among the Indians, the Australians, the Japanese, and a couple of other countries too. But it was called this kind of tsunami core group. Interestingly, a couple of years after that, then Japanese Prime Minister candidate Shinzo Abe, he raised the idea of turning the Tsunami Corps into something more formal and strategic, a kind of strategic dialogue. At the time, the Bush administration in Washington was already pushing a trilateral strategic dialogue of the U.S., Japan, and Australia. And, there were murmurings of support from the Bush administration about the idea of a quadrennial strategic dialogue that could include India. Remember, all these countries have democratically elected leaders, so getting them all on the same page due to nuanced political differences, some might be hawkish in one country at one time, some might be more liberal or soft power oriented at another. Getting them all on the same page at the same time takes a while. By the time that the Trump administration came in, you got to remember that Donald Trump was looking for friends around the world and really quickly struck up a friendship with Shinzo Abe, and they saw eye to eye on China. And Abe has been pushing this. It's not an anti-China agenda, but he had been pushing this. Look, we got to get serious, warning Western allies around the world about this autocratic power flexing of the Chinese Communist government in the Xi Jinping era. And Trump was all ears. You'll remember they actually met up at Mar-a-Lago right in Trump's first couple of months in office. And I think that the Trump administration quickly ran with the Quad idea. By the end of the Trump administration, it had become a centerpiece on the mantle of the Trump administration's countering or combating China policy to try and align the world's most powerful democracies. Let's say the Indo-Pacific's most powerful democracies.
So it was decades in the making, and you're the first reporter, Guy, that I can remember mentioning the Quad. I learned about it in one of our conversations in an earlier podcast. So it is not a military alliance as much as a soft power alliance. What was on the agenda in Washington?
The basics, COVID-19. How do these countries work together to move vaccines quickly over the next year?
Vaccine diplomacy, right?
That's right. Absolutely. And it's not just vaccine diplomacy. You're talking about power brokers here. these are the big time powers. These are countries with influence at the United Nations, influence geopolitically in the world. And if their leaders say, we're going to go back and push on business to try and make it so that the number of vaccines available to 60 countries across the Indo-Pacific is going to increase tenfold, there's a possibility that it'll actually happen. So COVID-19 is a big one. And then climate change. It becomes the agenda of whoever the leaders are of this ad hoc alignment. I'm always careful in my reporting to call it an alignment, not an alliance, because it is not a formal alliance. It could become one, but there are lots of politics that get involved in that very quickly, both within the Quad, but then also in terms of China's reaction to the Quad. If you call it an alliance, the Chinese have accused the United States of trying to militarize global policy and create an Asian NATO. This is something I think the Biden administration wants to avoid, a confrontation with Beijing over that rhetoric, and they don't call it an alliance. There is also the concern that the Indians, who are members of the non-aligned states movement, they've always resisted participation in military alliances. So they also talked about Afghanistan, paid a lot of lip service to the post-Afghanistan joint counterterrorism posture of the four countries. There isn't a lot of really frontal rhetoric towards China in the joint statement that came out of last month.
Let me ask you about that, because I listened to the Australian Prime Minister Morrison repeatedly say we want an Indo-Pacific free from coercion. That obviously is about China without using...
Absolutely. That's right.
So what do they mean by coercion? Who is China coercing?
Well, China is the biggest trading partner for most of the countries in Asia at this point. And the Chinese are constantly trying to wield the economic instrument of power to influence those countries, to get those countries not to agree to pass rules in ASEAN for preventing China from absorbing island chains all over the South China Sea, for instance. China has responded to things like leader-level virtual summits of the Quad, just getting the Australians, the Japanese, and the United States and the Indians in the room together. That leads the Chinese state media and the Chinese foreign ministry to come out with threats to say, hey, look, if the Americans go too far with this, we could punish some of the countries involved, saying, look, we're not going to allow Australian companies to sell wine inside China if you keep going along with this Quad stuff. That's a real-time example of what is meant by coercion. At the same time, the Chinese will go, say, to the South Koreans and say, do you want to continue having manufacturing relationships with Chinese companies to support your dominance in certain areas of the tech sector? If you do, then you cannot take X position on an issue regarding territorial disputes in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines.
Those are good examples.
Let me give you one very specific example of the coercion. This would be towards Hong Kong and what's happened in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has traditionally been a democratic enclave and a free market enclave right on the edge of China. The Chinese government in the Xi Jinping era has come in and begun imposing draconian surveillance laws, national security law in Hong Kong, and really cracked down on any dissent in media or in government or in business to what the Communist Party in Beijing says. That's a more overt type of coercion that's going on.
And finally, Guy, Biden and Xi had a phone call or two, announced they're going to have a summit soon. They discussed Taiwan, the Chinese Air Force intervening or crossing over into Taiwanese airspace, and the tensions there. Did they resolve anything?
Yeah, so the phone call actually was just about a month ago. And interestingly, President Biden brought it up this week as if it has just happened, but it was a month ago. And this phone call, supposedly, Biden claims that they talked about Taiwan, but the reality is the Taiwan issue is in the news because China is engaging in what I would describe as nearly unprecedented provocations against Taiwan. There's this risk that one of these Chinese incursions into Taiwanese space could trigger a response from Taiwan. And if that happens, there could be an escalation, and an escalation would severely test the status quo of the so-called one China policy, which is it's really a contradictory policy that has been in place since the early 1970s, which essentially says the U.S. recognizes China's sovereignty over Taiwan, but will militarily defend Taiwan if China ever tries to use force to impose that sovereignty. So the question is whether or not that issue is about to come to a head. And I think there's a lot of concern that the Chinese may not just be posturing, they may actually be preparing to sweep in and try and militarily take Taiwan, which is an island democracy now. I know that Taiwan has a complicated history going back to Chiang Kai-shek, but the reality is that in the last 30 or 40 years, Taiwan has been an island democracy aligned with the United States and is a key economic node of free markets in Southeast Asia, in a space of media freedom as well. So the idea that the Chinese government may just come in and take over the government in Taipei and possibly maybe willing to use force to do it could lead to a frightening escalation.
Guy Taylor, Washington Times National Security Team Leader, we thank you for checking in. And I'll remind our listeners, Guy has written a number of excellent articles about the China-Taiwan situation. You can read them at washingtontimes.com. Now let's dig deeper with Daniel Markey, senior expert on South Asia at the United States Institute of Peace. He's also a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And Andrew Scobell, a distinguished fellow with the China program at USIP. Andrew Scobell, welcome.
Thanks. Good to be here.
And Dan Markey, we welcome you as well.
My pleasure.
So, Andrew, let's start with you. The importance of the Quad meeting is being overshadowed by a potential crisis. China has sent scores of military planes into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. There is a history here that's important. The Taiwan Strait crises of the 1950s. Briefly, after communist victory in the Chinese Civil War, the nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek retreated to Taiwan, and since that day, the communists have wanted to reunify the island with the mainland. Why is that history important here?
Well, the Taiwan issue has been the most enduring and contentious in U.S. China relations. And I think it dates back to the end of the hot phase or the mainland portion of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, but it dates back to 1952 in the context of U.S. China relations. And that's because it became an issue at the same time that the Korean War erupted. And the reason for that, from a Chinese perspective, is that when President Truman ordered U.S. forces to the Korean Peninsula, that same directive in the same document, he instructed the 7th Fleet to interpose itself in the Taiwan Strait. And the Chinese could see it happening. Not that they had satellites back then, but it was clear what the U.S. was doing. So from a Chinese perspective, from a very, very early date, the U.S. sided with Taiwan, or from Beijing's perspective, put itself in the way, stopped China from achieving unification with Taiwan. And so it very much links up with the Korean War. In fact, from a U.S. perspective, the U.S. was pretty careful about, in Korea, trying to limit a so-called limited war, and the U.S. didn't even declare war on China or vice versa. And again, from a U.S. perspective, Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan offered to send troops to Korea to help the South Koreans and the U.S. and the UN forces. And the U.S. decided, I think wisely in my view, thanks, but no thanks. So from a U.S. perspective, they were managing things quite well. From a Chinese perspective, it's very different. And you go into the Taiwan Strait crisis of 54 and 58. The U.S. and Taiwan establish a defense pact. But going back to the Korean War, at the end of the Korean War, in mid-1951, both sides agreed to begin armistice talks. And both sides, wrongly, it turns out, thought these talks would be resolved pretty quickly. A sticking point, a major sticking point that came as a surprise to everyone was repatriation of POWs. And voluntary repatriation was something that the U.S. insisted on, and they stuck with that as a matter of principle. As a result of that, about 2/3 of the roughly 24,000 Chinese prisoners of war didn't go back to the mainland. They went to Taiwan. Again, from a Chinese perspective, the sticking point of Taiwan goes back well before the Taiwan Strait crisis and has been, up to this day, the major sticking point in U.S. China relations.
Dan, do you want to add to that?
I would totally agree. It's got a long history here, but in broader terms, it points to one of a number of fundamental differences between the United States and China that has the potential to erupt into outright militarized conflict. One of the differences between the China of the 50s and the China of today is that China is now a serious competitor to the United States in the global system. And China is also feeling not just aggrieved, but increasingly ambitious in its agenda for its nearby neighborhood and beyond. So these points of tension, to include Tibet as well, certainly in the South China Sea, but maybe increasingly in Eurasia, to include what happens or what unfolds in Afghanistan and so on. We'll see how that turns out, but we can see points of friction emerging. But this is a long-standing one. And so when we see this pop up again, it really touches a nerve with both sides.
If I could just add one more thing on Taiwan to reinforce that this is an issue that has persisted across time, much to the frustration of the Chinese side. So when you go to the early 1970s, the rapprochement in U.S. China relations, Taiwan was the big sticking point. And the U.S. knew that. And the agreement to improve relations was predicated on that the U.S. was recognized or acknowledged that Taiwan was part of China and would pull back from support for Taiwan. Then by the late 1970s, again, the big sticking point in normalizing diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China was, surprise, surprise, Taiwan. In both of those episodes, the Chinese thought they had pinned the U.S. down and the issue had been resolved, quote unquote, as an issue in U.S.-China relations, and unification would inevitably follow at some point. So from a Chinese perspective, fast forward to today, the past decades are indication that the U.S. was not sincere about this. So there's a real grudge and frustration that the U.S. has been two-faced on this issue. So that really provides some context for what's going on today.
You're referring to the one China policy, and as you just described it, it is a contradiction, right? So the reason I chose the Taiwan Strait crises of the 1950s to frame the discussion, China views Taiwan as its issue. This is its backyard. And as early as 1955, Congress passed the Formosa Resolution, gave President Eisenhower total authority to defend Taiwan and the offshore islands. Well, maybe that made sense in the Cold War contexts of the time. But today, it seems like China has the same stance, that Taiwan is its issue and the United States needs to butt out, to put it simply.
I will jump in on this one and say it's clear that China feels that way. But I think another thing to keep in mind is that over the decades, Taiwan has also changed. And now, not only does the United States see Taiwan as it did at the end of the Chinese Civil War, but it also sees it as an increasingly successful democratic state in Asia and a partner that it has armed and done business with now for many, many years. And as certainly the Biden administration is increasingly framing the global competition with China in terms of democracy versus autocracy and means of governance, Taiwan takes on special importance, not least in the aftermath of China's increasing repression in Hong Kong. Taiwan is now an outlier, claimed still by China, certainly, but with a very different governance system. And the United States doesn't just see it as another piece of land or, an island out there, but an example of a democracy in Asia and a partner that is worth defending. So it has taken on a significance beyond its initial significance when it wasn't a democratic partner in Asia.
That's true. The contexts have changed. Taiwan is an important cog in the capitalist, open markets economy of the Indo-Pacific. It has an open media. It is a democracy. But I guess the question, Andrew Scobell, is how far might the United States have to go to defend Taiwan if that is in fact our policy? Is a war worth it?
Well, the changes that Dan pointed out are important to note, but one consistent thing has been that the Taiwan Strait has been the perennial flashpoint and the most likely location of a conflict between the U.S. and China. So to get into your question, is it worth it? I would dodge the question by saying I'm a recovering political scientist, so
it's the wrong question.
It is worth thinking very carefully about and paying close attention to because it is a serious situation. But on the positive side, both the U.S. and, for that matter, Taiwan, none of the three parties want this to escalate to conflict. But there is plenty of room, unfortunately, for misunderstanding and unintended escalation.
Wars do start by accident. I was going to say it's the wrong question. Maybe I should have asked, in what ways can a war be avoided? Because as you just said, it's not in anyone's interest to have a military conflict over this. So that's a good segue to the Quad, which is not a military alliance. It's not even referred to as an alliance. It's a cooperative grouping. Dan, why don't you tell us what the Quad actually is?
Yeah, I think the words cooperative grouping are a good way to summarize the Quad, meaning four, so the United States, Australia, Japan, and India coming together in September for the first time at the leader level in person. This is an organization or a grouping that has evolved out of, back in 2004, a response to the tsunami. These four countries came together to provide humanitarian relief and assistance to devastated countries in the region. And they did so because they brought different capabilities to the table, a kind of a ad hoc response, but it reflected a shared commitment to this type of activity. And they recognized that, well, if we could cooperate in this context, maybe we can cooperate in others. Now, that's 2004. So, it's taken a long time for this to come together as something more than that. And that's reflected some degree of reticence, certainly on the part of, at times, Australia, at times, India, to be seen as a countervailing coalition against China. At various points, they've been very reluctant to do so. But over the past few years, that reluctance has really vanished. And of course, Japan has always been concerned about China. So they've come together much more consistently and now have really, certainly under the Biden administrations, this has really accelerated with a virtual meeting back in March of this past year, and now a real in-person meeting in September. We've never seen anything like this. But as you pointed out, it's not a military alliance. It's not going to be an alliance, particularly because India is not interested in that. And their focus has been on non-military areas, things like vaccine diplomacy, other areas of cooperation in technology, education, and so on. That's what they'd like to build out. But they frame themselves as maritime democracies of Asia. And so very clearly, even if they don't say the word China, this is intended to be something that China is not a part of and an alternative to China and Chinese leadership in the region.
This looks like soft power, the exercise of soft power, because, Andrew, China has practiced economic coercion against some of these countries, hasn't it?
Right. As Dan said, the Quad is a non-military grouping. I think the terminology that the Quad seems to use is a partnership. But from a Chinese perspective, they see it as an anti-China coalition. Why? All these countries are democracies. And from a Chinese perspective, of course, the U.S., they've always been suspicious of the U.S. harboring anti-Chinese tendencies or anti-Communist Party tendencies. They believe this conspiracy the U.S. has to undermine Communist Party rule in China. This term doesn't get thrown around much lately, but it did in previous decades, the so-called China threat theory that China tried to rebuff, arguing that China's rise didn't constitute a threat. Significantly, two countries, aside from the U.S., that they identified as key centers that perpetuated the China threat theory and hence made China upset were Japan and India. So 3 of the 4 members of the Quad, not top of China's hit parade. And most recently, Australia became the focal point of Chinese ire as it became more resistant to Chinese influence operations and so on, and hence the focus of Chinese economic coercion. So from a Chinese perspective, this may not have a explicit military component, but it's very much focused on containing China. And from a Chinese perspective, this looks like they're trying to encircle China, even though if you look at the declaration issued from the recent meeting that Dan referred to, there is no mention of China whatsoever.
Here's a couple of lines from a commentary written by Natasha Kassam for the Lowy Institute. Australia has been feeling the chill of China's diplomatic freezer for a number of years. The frostbite is now economic, with tariffs on barley, bans on beef, and a travel warning, potentially deterring tourists and students alike from returning to Australia when borders reopen. So that's just an example of some of the problems they're having. And I guess they're hoping that the Quad, Dan Markey, can alleviate these issues. How?
Yeah, so coming together, Australia's felt, as you put it, the bite of Chinese economic coercion, but so have at various points Japan, which saw the Chinese attempt to use a restriction on rare earth minerals to Japan as a means to put pressure on them. And so has India at various points, not just economic coercion, but we've seen outright border skirmishing over the past couple of years along their contested border. The response to some of this is what they're talking about, secure and resilient supply chains, meaning that what they will try to do is work together to make sure that they can get the stuff that they need to feed their industrial bases, even if China tries to restrict it. In other words, to find workarounds or defenses against some of the economic coercive practices China may undertake. And this is the kind of thing, certainly for the Indian pharmaceutical industry, which is heavily dependent upon Chinese precursor chemicals and things like that, or the Japanese high-tech industry, also dependent upon Chinese materials. They need to find workarounds and they need to protect themselves from this sort of pressure. So they're hoping that by banding together, they may find better means to do that.
The reason I find this Quad situation or this development so important is because it is soft power. The United States has spent the past 20 years fighting terrorism. The global war on terrorism has been a disaster. But what has China been up to over the past 20 years or so, Andrew? After the Tiananmen Square massacre, China was a pariah. It's fairly amazing to think what it's doing now, Belt and Road and other initiatives to grow its economic power globally.
I would say there's two phases in China's economic reform period and also in its military modernization. Pre-1989, pre-Tiananmen, the emphasis was on economics, and the military modernization took a backseat, the last of the so-called four modernizations. But after Tiananmen and the early 1990s, China came back from that pariah status you mentioned, combined from a Chinese perspective, noting the collapse of communism, the end of the Soviet Union. So on the one hand, China doubled down and restarted economic reform and opening in the 1990s. And this included a serious outreach effort to the developing world. I mean, in the 1980s, the attention was more on the developed world. But in the 1990s, greater attention to the developing world to expand Chinese markets, and China's economy began to take off in a major way. And not only did it need markets, but it needed resources, and these could be extracted from the developing world. Also in the 1990s, China saw more ominous environment in Asia and beyond, and began to put much more resources towards military modernization. And then going back to, we're on a theme here with Taiwan, I think the 95-96 Taiwan Strait crisis was an event that focused Chinese attention to the military threat that they saw from the U.S. and what they saw as a need to get very serious about acquiring the kinds of capabilities, military capabilities, that could be used not just against Taiwan, but also in the Western Pacific to counter the United States and its allies.
A recurring theme here is each side views the other's moves as aggressive and its own moves as defensive. So back to the Quad. It sounds like it's playing catch up here.
The Quad is playing catch up in a sense. What the United States has struggled with as China has come forward with a variety of new initiatives. Andrew's painted a long story of structural change and political change and reform in China that's led to a capacity to do more in the world. And what we've seen over the past decade is an emphasis on big, new, flashy initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative that the United States has struggled to come up with an appropriate response to. And the Quad is a part of that. We used the word soft power before. A big part of what Belt and Road is, it's a lot of money for infrastructure development and so on, but there's also a lot of branding, and there's a lot of diplomacy, and there's a lot of convening, bringing people to China to celebrate China's arrival as a great power in the international system and its ambition to remake that system in some important ways. And the United States has also been bogged down in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So a lot of its attention has been focused elsewhere over the past 2 decades. And just now with the Quad, this is partially an attempt to make up for that lost time. But it's not enough. I mean, it's a beginning point, and it's a piece of a broader Indo-Pacific strategy. And it reflects certainly the Biden administration's desire to shift attention away from the Middle East and the war in Afghanistan to the Indo-Pacific. But it is just a beginning.
And there must be areas of cooperation as well, not just competition and confrontation between the U.S. and China.
Despite these current tensions, and I would say U.S.-China relations are at the lowest point today that they've been in decades. But despite that, the two sides recognize it's in both of their interests to avoid military conflict, and they're quite motivated to try and make sure that doesn't happen. They're willing to meet. There have been important meetings, most recently in Zurich, between the National Security Advisor and roughly his Chinese counterpart. The one in Zurich happened on neutral ground. Why? Because neither side wants to give the other any semblance of a home field advantage, so to speak. And I think it speaks to the underlying tensions in the relationship, while at the same time suggesting at least that both sides are serious about trying to cooperate on things of mutual concerns like global warming and other areas. But I think problems like Taiwan and these lingering suspicions and distrust make progress on any one of these issues not impossible, but very, very challenging.
Dan, my final question is, how does the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan complicate things? It appears that China is trying to reach an accommodation with the Taliban and to coexist.
We and the Chinese and all of Afghanistan's neighbors at this moment don't have too many options other than trying to find a way forward with what exists in Afghanistan, which right now is Taliban dominance. We'll see how that plays out. You might imagine that the U.S. departure from China's backyard in Afghanistan would redound to the benefit of U.S.-China relations. For the past 20 years, at least some in China have been complaining about seeing U.S. military forces so close to their borders, not just on the Taiwan side, but on the Western side as well. Problem is, the United States, when it also left Afghanistan in many ways a mess, and certainly not the way that most Americans would have liked to see it end, but also not the way that the Chinese would have liked to see it end. They would have preferred a great deal more stability and a great deal less uncertainty. The United States, in many ways, has actually created a new headache for China, and some in China are definitely portraying it that way. And there's one other aspect, which is when the Chinese do attempt to make their own peace with the Taliban, they could run into trouble with the United States. I mean, like I said, nobody has a choice other than the Taliban. But if the Chinese look too cozy with this new regime in Afghanistan, the United States will see that, or at least some of the United States will see that as another example of China warming to our adversaries and taking advantage of opportunities to make us look bad. So this is a tricky one. It's not so easy to manage. And it's hard to see, Andrew was talking about the challenges of cooperation. The United States and China actually have a fair amount of common ground in Afghanistan, what we really don't want to see, which is international terrorists getting a foothold there that would hurt us and our shared interests. So you'd think on the basis of that, we could cooperate a bit better, but that doesn't make it that much easier.
And no one wants to see refugees either, millions of them flowing
Correct.
out of Afghanistan. Andrew, any final thoughts there?
Honestly, I don't think there's that much danger of high probability of China and the Taliban getting cozy. There's wariness, uneasiness. There are good reasons for the two of them to cooperate, but they also, I think there's underlying distrust. And it's kind of paradoxical that we see China, the Chinese are coming everywhere. They're being aggressive or assertive all around the world. And yet, in some places like Afghanistan, on their periphery, they're really very reluctant to be assertive. They're very afraid of stepping into the graveyard of empires. And the last point I make is that while they're happy to see the U.S. go, they wish that the outsourcing of the Afghan problem to the U.S. had been a lot more successful.
China would also point to the fact that it is the U.S., not China, that has 800, 900 bases around the globe, many of them ringing the Eurasian continent.
We'll have to wait and see. How is China going to compete with the United States? We've certainly seen one official base in Djibouti, but
is that China's first overseas base?
Official overseas base. There are some unofficial bases, but certainly a challenge for China is they've got these increasing, expanding overseas interests around the world and in some unstable places like African countries and Middle Eastern countries. And the challenge is, how does China go about protecting its interests in these countries? And my analysis is that China hasn't figured this out yet. But in some cases, that may require overseas outposts. We'll see more military bases. But these won't happen very quickly because, like in Afghanistan, China's very wary, will move forward very, very cautiously before it commits itself in a similar way as it has in Djibouti.
Andrew Scobell and Daniel Markey of the United States Institute of Peace, we value your insights, and we'll continue to dedicate episodes to U.S. China relations, the defining relationship of the 21st century. On the next episode of History as It Happens, if the U.S. wants to deal with China, it may finally really have to get out of the Middle East.
What we do know is that the terrorists who planned and carried out this cynical and cowardly attack have failed in their purpose. They mistakenly believe that if they're cruel enough and violent enough, they will weaken American resolve and deter us from our effort to help build a lasting and secure peace in the Middle East.
An interview with Andrew Bacevich about a decision in 1983 that helped lay the groundwork for the forever wars of today. That's next when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.